What do you know about politics? What should you know? Forget views, beliefs, and opinions. Politics is really a science, and that's where we come in. Welcome to Inside Political Science. I'm Kirby Goodell.
I'm Todd Kent, and we're your guides to what's actually happening in politics. We're using our years of experience to navigate political data, media, money, behavior, and more to educate and inform you.
Welcome to Inside Political Science. I'm Kirby Goodell. Todd Kent, my co-conspirator, is in Europe right now with a great group of Texas A&M students having the time of their lives. So I brought on a guest, my good friend, my co-conspirator, my co-author, Cliff Young from Ipsos. And I'll give a better introduction, Cliff, but welcome to Inside Political Science.
It's great to be here, Kirby. Look forward to chatting.
Yeah, and so Cliff is the president at Ipsos. He is a PhD in sociology from the University of Chicago. He walks in both the academic world and in the practical politics world. I've joked with him before and called him the unicorn. But what's really neat, I think, is you have a couple of books. You've written a lot of different things, but your first book, Polls, Pollsters, and Public Opinion, talks about the role of the pollster in public life and how pollsters interact and describe and interpret data. And you have a recent column in the Conversation about why getting the numbers isn't enough. Can you talk a little bit about what it means to be a pollster and what you see? And I'll even condition this just a little bit more. I think good pollsters aren't statisticians. They're statisticians, they're psychologists, they're sociologists, they're political scientists, they're economists, and they're historians if they really want to do a good job. Did I just answer the question? What is the role of the pollster in contemporary society?
So we're Renaissance people. That's what you're saying, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah. Well, first and foremost, I think it's important that we define our terms. I'm not an upholsterer. I don't redo sofas and chairs. At one point in my career, way at the beginning, someone I know thought I was, after a long conversation, asked what I did, and I said I was a pollster, and they thought I was an upholsterer, and was kind of startled when I said that, and gave me their card to redo their sofa. So we don't do that. Pollsters ultimately measure and analyze public opinion. I would argue that we're critical linchpins in democracy. We bring voice to people. We're that kind of critical link between those who govern and those who are governed. And so a lot of what I do today is working with decision makers on the political side, as well as the private sector side, to understand what people in society are thinking at any one given time, or what they're ultimately going to do. Obviously, we're a modern invention. We didn't exist 200 years ago. So democracy predates us, but we rose as a result of, the advent of the scientific sample, of sort of scientific ways of measuring people's attitudes and opinions. But ultimately, that's what we do. And obviously, a lot of what people see is the technical side. It's the accuracy of our polls on election day, whether we got it close or not. That ultimately is an important sort of role or activity that we have. We really pay attention to our craft, because if we get it wrong, we ultimately have problems the next day with our reputation and the like. But we do so much more. And as I was defining, before, we help decision makers understand what people think, so they can make optimal decisions, so that they can properly navigate society. We help again, people understand the contours of the future. It's not always about predicting an election. It's about understanding the possibilities out there. Let's take the example of tariffs. Is the Trump administration going to implement, a full-blown, complete tariff regime? Will he pull back? Will it be somewhere in the middle? Public opinion plays into that, because it sets the limits in which political actors can ultimately operate. So yes, to your sort of your simple question, the pollster does all these sorts of things. The pollster does measure. That's very important. We measure public opinion, but we also interpret public opinion, which I would make the argument is equally, if not more important than just the measurement.
Yeah, and in 2024, just measuring the numbers, pollsters really, I think we have a lot of people, if you just ask them, how did the pollsters do? If you just did a poll on it, you would find that most people didn't think the polls did very well. But really, in terms of the numbers, we did a pretty good job. But there were other things we didn't do as well at, right?
Yeah, and so if you take the performance of the polls in aggregate in 2024, and you compare them to the global average, the polls performed well within that average. And so we have to understand that. Now, there's a perception that the polls didn't do very well. And there's a couple things going on. First and foremost, we live today, and you and I have worked on that, right, Kirby? We've worked a lot on sort of issues of populism and belief that the system is broken. And we know that not just the United States, but globally, there's a widespread belief that the system is broken. And I say that because the pollster is part of the system, is perceived as part of the system. So there's a initial starting point of doubt and a degree of skepticism when it comes to the polls. I think we battle that today, but ultimately, I would say we had two specific problems when it came to 2024. On the one hand, yes, we were within the global standards in terms of error, but we erred on average against Trump and in favor of Harris, against the Republicans and in favor of the Democrats. That's the third electoral cycle that's happened. By the way, that's a problem in other countries as well. We're having problems, us pollsters, with the right, with the rise of the populist right. And whether it be Brazil or Turkey or France, we're having these sorts of problems which are reoccurring. Again, within the standard, but still erring on one side versus the other. That kind of reinforces, a lack of credibility or belief in us. And the other point, which I think is more critical, is that, I believe it's the pollster's charge or responsibility to ensure that people aren't surprised by the future. Right. It might be that we don't get it exactly right, but we lay out the sort of the story in a way, the data in a way that people aren't surprised. And I think people were surprised with the election. Indeed, going into the stretch run, everyone was saying it was 50-50, 50-50, 50-50. It wasn't quite 50-50. It was more like, it was more like, 48-52, 52-48 for the sake of argument. The perception on election day was that Trump won by a lot more. That gap narrowed, obviously, over time. That's the nature of kind of counting the vote. But people were surprised. And so, again, I think overall, we're kind of within the standards. That said, we're not very credible when it comes to a profession at this point. And we've erred on one side over the other. And people were surprised by the degree of victory by Trump.
Yeah, even though it was much more narrow than people thought about. But one of the things, too, that I think people don't fully understand about polling and why it continues to be valuable, even as it's getting all these criticisms, and why people are looking to pollsters to make sense of the world, is the thing that I think we do when we do it very well is we provide people with strategic, actionable information. And the way that, and where I think you especially have sort of a unique skill set there, is you look at the numbers and you give a lot of nuance. You don't just, you're not just, here's what the number is, take it or leave it. You're explaining the numbers with other numbers and with other context. And then you also really show a lot about narrative, and you fit it within the narrative. And for one of the other things that I should have noted at the beginning of the introduction, you have a great Substack with these great columns that really tell stories and really highlight what's going on in contemporary society through the narrative. But talk a little bit about the importance of strategic decision making and how
Yeah, that's
polls can
great. So that,
inform that.
ultimately this goes back to your point about the story, the narrative, the context. I think context is critical. I actually understand public opinion as a decision-making constraint. In a democracy, obviously, public opinion determines who will win and who won't. Right? We know, for instance, that the candidate strongest on the main issue wins on average 85% of the time. There's 15% off diagonal, so like that's just a proof point showing the importance of public opinion for outcomes. In this case, electoral outcomes. But I understand that writ large, that public opinion again sets the boundaries within which political actors can operate. What you can and can't do. By the way, you can do things that goes against public opinion, but you're going to lose legitimacy, or more specifically, you're going to lose approval points, or your approval rating will fall. And so a lot of what I do with clients is understanding their decision space when it comes to public opinion, what they can and what they can't do, what's possible, what's not possible, where they're going to coast easily versus produce friction, which ultimately can hurt them in terms of their numbers. And again, just using the example of tariffs, it's very clear if you look at the data, it's not 100 or 0, right? And it's nuanced there. And on the one hand, public opinion is worried about the short term, especially full-blown tariffs, about inflation, a lot of worry about the inflationary aspects of tariffs. On the flip side, they don't like bad actors, countries that are not behaving by the rules. And they even give license to punish them, China and others included. So it suggests that, on the one hand, a full tariff regime probably isn't or wasn't possible. Doing nothing probably isn't doable as well. Some sort of limited, more prescriptive, more focused set of policies related to tariffs is more likely to be successful than not. And oh, by the way, this is something we painted 3 months ago. This is the scenario we defined, and what do we find? We ultimately find that the Trump administration went up to the limits of the possibility. Lots of friction, a lot of noise, a lot of worry, a lot of unease and trepidation within public opinion, and then Trump and the administration pulling back a bit, delaying things, and probably will fall into a more sort of humble tariff regime. Again, we don't know exactly what's going to happen in a specific way, but what we just did right now was lay out the possible contours of the future, and this is in part how we help clients and decision makers. On the flip side, and it goes without saying, we help them engage public opinion as well. So, like, what are optimal ways of messaging to people? What will be more sticky versus not? This is the sort of activity we engage in considerably when we're dealing with decision makers, and more specifically our clients.
Now, you've already hit on a lot of this, but if you're talking to a CEO right now, hypothetical CEO, and you're giving them the briefing, what are you emphasizing about where we are in the contemporary moment? What's the thing that's really driving your attention that you really want to emphasize to that person?
I think there's obviously we're always going to be looking at approval ratings, and we have to understand the importance of approval ratings are manifold, right? The most important predictor of electoral success. We know that a sitting president at 40% approval ratings has better than a 50-50 chance of winning the next election. By the way, this is based upon models that are global, not just in the U.S. We use them all over the world. I just use it as a proof point to kind of reinforce the importance of approval ratings. Even though Trump can't run again, it gives you a relative idea of his strength. He's at 45, which if he were to run tomorrow, he'd be in the 70s in terms of likelihood of winning, 70s or 80s.
Sorry to jump in real quick, because I think a lot of people look at 45 and say, that's not very good. He's underwater. His disapproval's not. But that's not the way you look at the polls, right?
No, I don't think that's without context, right?
Yeah.
And 45. I don't tend to look at the delta between positive and negative, approval and disapproval.
Right.
That's just a function of collecting data all over the world. And the easiest way to do it was to collect the positive side. There might be some merit to that, but let's just kind of set that aside for a second. No, we look at the positive side of the approval scale and have used that to benchmark governments, right? And 45% is a good place. Obviously, during the election, you're going to be able to bring people back into the fold again. We always have to remember that people might be upset with you, but you're going to bring them back in. And by the way, 45% is among all adults, not necessarily those who vote. And so, again, for an incumbent, it's a good place to be. And so so we're looking at his approval ratings because that gives an idea about his relative staying power in the short to medium term. And just very quickly, he declined more quickly than the historic average, which was 3 points in the first 100 days. He declined 6 points. That was once again a function of a lot of friction, a lot of bumping up against where public opinion was and what they thought was reasonable. He's since improved as he stepped off the gas a bit. He's improved a couple points, and so he's in the mid to mid high 40s, which is a very good place to be. It's a strong place to be in this first half of the first year. The other two things we're looking at relative to that, obviously, are specifically the politics of tariffs. We've talked about that a bit, and immigration. Right, those are the two big ticket items that are that many are looking at because they have impact on economics. Specifically, we've worked a lot with clients on the tariff side, not just laying out what might happen, but its potential impact on household consumption, the behavior of companies, as an example. Immigration, looking a lot at immigration, its impact on business. It has a dual impact, both on the labor market on the one hand, uncertainty in the labor market on the one hand, but also on the consumer side. Illegal undocumented immigrants spend a lot of money too, right? These are worries. Actually, retail is worried about that. Consumer packaged goods companies are worried about those sorts of things. Obviously, other issues like government efficiency are there as well. But those kind of three issues, the approval ratings, which give an idea about whether he can push forward his agenda, together with the politics of tariffs, the politics and economics of tariffs, and the politics and economics of immigration have been the central points we've looked at.
Well, a couple of things, and one of them is Trump seems to be unique, at least in the current moment, and you can tell me whether he really is unique, but that it seems like his voters and his base understand the payoff isn't coming right away.
I think that's fair. So it's a very interesting. One of the talking points by Trump and Republicans more generally has been short-term pain for long-term gain. We've really tested that a lot. I think it's a critical point. And then obviously Republicans agree with that statement. Like a super majority of Republicans agree with that statement. In other words, he has a lot of resiliency with his base. He has obviously much less support with Democrats and somewhat less support with independents. Critical point. I wouldn't say he garners a consensus on that, but he splits the population, splits Americans on that 50-50 in terms of their belief overall. But when you put in benefits like, in the long term, it's going to bring manufacturing back to the U.S., or in the long term, it'll bring jobs back to the U.S., then you begin to have stronger majorities agreeing with that. In other words, yes, there is short-term pain, but there are benefits longer term. So what we can say, in a general sense, Americans are very worried about today. There's a lot of uncertainty, unease, trepidation, as I've already sort of mentioned. But there's some sort of understanding about benefits longer term. And I think that's the slipstream that Trump has, that Trump has that's the juxtaposition or that kind of middle place that he can work on. Obviously, if the real economy, unemployment and inflation have a really gnarly kickback and a negative impact, then all bets are off. But right now, the administration's actually in a relatively good place, all things considered.
Yeah, and strong on a couple of key issues, and it seems like maybe they did some initial damage in terms of breaking things too quickly or breaking too much, or that the method was problematic. But as you sort of mentioned, they pulled back a little, and with pulling back, they've seen some approval pick up. Is that fair?
Yeah, that's my interpretation. My interpretation is that they've gained a few points in the last little bit. Because they backed off of tariffs. They put a kind of, they put a pause on them. There's a lot of friction around that, a lot of trepidation. And by the way, the friction wasn't just a public opinion, it was elite opinion as well. I mean, you had pushback from Wall Street, you pushed back from business. You had at one point both Wall Street as well as Main Street calling him and calling the administration, calling the White House, and basically warning him of the risks associated with what they're doing. Now, yeah, I think he's improved a bit because of that. Now we'll see with immigration. Now we have a whole new sort of like iteration now of the Trump administration pushing up against convention, forwarding convention, and we'll see sort of like how they hold their numbers together. But I think the events in, let's say, California and Los Angeles are another test of that. What I would say is the immigration issue is not sort of, kind of proportionally distributed across the population. Like people's worry about the economy is like, it's pretty widespread. They're either everyone needs to make ends meet. On the immigration issue, there is definitely a rift, a cleavage in America. Some people are disproportionately affected, are disproportionately worry about it. And so we'll see what the outcome is.
All right. Well, with that, we're going to take a quick break, and we're going to come back and we're going to talk more about immigration and nativist nation and the Ipsos globalism poll. So we'll be right back.
Howdy, I'm John Nichols. I'm a long-term patron of KMU and KMU TV. Federal funding in public television, public radio is being cut back and being threatened by federal funding reductions. I ask you to follow that discussion, but also make your own pledge and become a regular supporter of KMU TV and FM. Thank you.
This is Ira Glass. On This American Life, we like stories that surprise you. For instance, imagine finding a new hobby and realizing
to do this hobby right, according to the ways of the masters, there's a pretty good chance that you're going to have to bend the law to get the materials that you need.
If not break it.
Yeah, to break international laws.
real life stories, really good ones, every week. Saturdays at noon on KAMU FM.
Welcome back to Inside Political Science. I'm here with our guest, Cliff Young from Ipsos. And also, I didn't mention in the front part of this, but Cliff will be here teaching public opinion in the fall.
Yeah, woo!
No, we're really excited. Cliff has taught in lots of different places and leading universities, and getting him to come down and teach Texas A&M. I can't wait to see the interaction with the students. This is going to be fantastic. Also, we have a book coming out in September, Nativist Nation, Populism, Grievance, Identity, and the Transformation of American Politics. And you also have, at Ipsos, you just released the 10th Global Populism Survey. And hopefully those things line up neatly in our listeners' minds, because they line up really, really neatly. What's going on in the world, what's going on in the U.S., what's going on in the world. All of this is the same forces are everywhere, huh?
Yeah, I mean, the forces that shaped our world in 2016 rise of Trump, Brexit as the two critical initial examples, are still shaping our world today. If nothing more, I would say they're more ingrained in the political muscle memory. We have more parties and politicians that represent this strain of anti-establishment sentiment and nativist sentiment in the world than we did in 2016.
Yeah, but it's the mistake I think sometimes we believe is everything going on in the U.S. political system for those of us who are maybe more narrowly focused is not going on throughout the world. But this anti-establishment attitude is everywhere, right? And this desire. Maybe it's not widespread, but this desire for a strong leader, for strong leadership, because the system is broken, that's coming up in all sorts of places, in all sorts of different ways.
Yeah, no, indeed. The forces that created the world or shaping the world in 2016 are the same today. And to your point, it's global. It's not local. It might take on different flavors in different forms in different places, right? Every country, every society, every context is different, but it is global in nature. And just very quickly, we developed an index, we developed a measure. By the way, in 2004 in Latin America, I was in Brazil for 10 years, and we were trying to understand the rise of the populist leaders like Chavez and Morales in Venezuela, Morales in Bolivia, Lula in Brazil, and we developed an index called the System is Broken Index.
Yeah.
And it basically it's a rationale. We actually did lots of focus groups, and it kept on appearing kind of the logic of it. And the logic is kind of like this. Our country is very rich, but why are we so disadvantaged? We're disadvantaged because, parties and politicians and elite no longer care about people like us, right? What do we have to do? We need a strong leader, and a strong leader, even if he or she has to break the rules, they should, to take the country back. Right. And that's a kind of a syndrome, right? That's an anti-establishment worldview that was, that existed in Latin America, that we basically found it, we saw it when we developed the measures. Then we forgot about them, Kirby. We forgot about them. And then in 2015, we started seeing around us the same sort of logic, rationale, belief that the system was broken, belief that parties and politicians no longer cared about the average person, belief that the elites were rigging the system. And we hear that everywhere, right? The need for a strong leader to take the country back, right? And, we dusted off the index. We started, administering it here in the United States in 2016 to understand the rise of Trump. And then we started, once again, we have a global poll. 2016, we started applying it all over the world. And we found as we already said, it's everywhere.
Yeah, and with that, at the same time, one of the challenges is, or part of the context is, the world is globalizing, right? And there's international trade, and there's the embrace of international trade, and there is immigration coming in, and people are moving more freely across borders, and this is creating its own political dynamic, right?
Yeah, I mean, obviously the globalization, the flattening of the world makes everything closer, not farther away. Many of the forces that create the world from that perspective are those forces that also lead to this anti-establishment perspective. But without a doubt, sort of like this is something we saw in 2024 with all the elections, a very much ingrained belief that the system was broken, and we saw in whether it be South Africa or Indonesia or India or Mexico or the United States as examples, we saw sort of the muscularity of anti-establishment parties and politicians.
Yeah, the system is broken. We need a strong leader to fix it. And there are all these people coming into the country, and they're changing what it means for me to be an American. That's a pretty widespread belief, right?
Yeah, and so there's I see it as like two different dimensions, right? So you have the one dimension, which is anti-establishment, and the other dimension, which is nativism, right, or belonging. And this is what you and I have written on, right?
Yeah.
In our new book. And what we find is that nativism, that is, preferring native-born over foreign-born in policy, attitude, in behavior. What we find is that it is the most important predictor of politics in the United States and globally.
Yeah.
It's a very consistent belief system, worldview, and something something we emphasize obviously is that we should maybe nativism isn't a bad word. We have to understand it at its more profound or underlying point, which is it's about belonging. And so we're in the middle of a political conflict about who counts and who doesn't count in democracy, who is an American and who isn't an American. We're seeing this, by the way, playing out today in the United States with the immigration debate. There's half the population, half of Americans believe that someone here illegally doesn't have any rights because they became here illegally. You have another, half of the population that believes that they at least should be given due process, right? And that just kind of goes to the notion of who belongs and who doesn't, who counts and who doesn't. And it's playing out obviously in the United States, but it's playing out all the way around the world. So.
And it's such a fundamental political question, right? And so I think one of the things that we try to do is sort of lay bare the idea that you can't not ask the question. You can't just ignore the question, because who counts as a citizen, who doesn't count as a citizen, that's fundamental to the nature of politics. Politics doesn't get any more basic than that. And within the American context, there's especially this distinction between these people who believe that if you share the right ideas, you're American, versus people who believe, no, you need ancestry, you need to be born, and those are very different ideas. And those aren't just in the U.S., they're everywhere, right? I mean, the French deal with the same issue. Is it about ideas, or is it about birthplace?
Yeah, so exactly. So we find both in the United States and globally that you have one group of people that have a much more restrictive notion of what it means to belong. And that tends to be very ascriptive aspects, right? Like, were you born in the country or not? Maybe your ethnicity, maybe your religion. And then you have others that believe that it's about what you think and what you believe, right? Your civic values, your values. In the United States, we see that today, right? We have these two groups, one more restrictive, the other one less restrictive in how they see who is and who is not an American. But this isn't just an American phenomenon, right? Yeah. This is, this is a global phenomenon. We find the same sort of distinction between more restrictive, less restrictive, more focused on ascriptive aspects of an individual, more immutable characteristics of an individual versus values. And we see that, across the board. Indeed, the global populism poll we did this year, we included a national identity battery. And we found that, this sort of distinction, this sort of differential understanding of who is and is not is a global phenomenon.
Yeah, and also one of the things that I think is a little surprising to people too, when I've talked about it anyway, is that nativism isn't actually increasing; it's just polarizing.
Yeah, it's sort of it's contradictory, right? So what we found in the United States, at the very least, is that it's declining in importance. And what we find is that especially Democrats have increasingly become less nativist, whereas Republicans have basically been flatlined. Maybe they become a little bit more nativist. But on average, nativism is declining in terms of importance, in terms of adherence. But the rift between the Republicans and Democrats, between the partisans, is only increasing when it comes to nativist values. And so it just goes to show that it's not about, when we talk about politics, it's often not about levels. It's about difference, right?
Yeah.
And the nativist difference has only increased over time, as you know, as we have a whole chapter on trends in nativism, and it's very clear where we are today. We have something like a 30 to 40 point difference in nativism between Republicans and Democrats today, whereas in 1996 there was a 0% point difference.
Yeah, and it also one of the other things that I think people are surprised when we talk to them about it is it doesn't start in 2016. Donald Trump seems to recognize it and accelerate the growth in the gap, but the gap is beginning, 2008?
Yeah, I mean, it kind of corresponds with Obama.
Yeah.
I mean, we have, whether it was Obama or Obama just was a symptom, or just or completely spurious. That's another, that's another possibility. But it definitely it starts with the Obama administration, and obviously a lot of the rhetoric around sort of whether he was eligible to be, whether he was an American or not, whether he was eligible to be president or not, the birther issue is sort of the origin story. As you pointed out a lot, Kirby, the origin story of this nativist story.
Yeah. And so then as we look here at current events, we're watching in California as events are coming to a head, and there's issues of federal versus state government, but also the immigration issues at stake. How do you think this plays out, given what we know about immigration attitudes and immigration politics?
Well, I don't think we have consensus.
Yeah.
And I think that there won't be consensus. And indeed, you have the actions taken by the federal government, by the Trump administration, are deeply held with the base, and they're seen as legitimate with the base, that is Republican base, but they're not seen as legitimate with the rest of the population. Like there's a gulf there between sort of the two sides in terms of what can and can't be done. And what's being done in Los Angeles today is not seen as legitimate by a chunk of the population. What I'd lay out is a bit like about a third, or at least our research has showed about a third of the population, American population, is staunchly nativist, right? Nativists do or die, right? And they would be totally in favor of what the Trump administration is doing. Then you have between 20 and 25% of the population that there's varying degrees of acceptance. There may be a belief that there's a problem with illegal immigration. There has to be something done. Maybe you deport some of the illegal immigrants who are criminals. There's some condition, but there's conditionality to it. And then the rest of the population is staunchly against any sort of strong actions taken against it. Indeed, their notion of being an American, once again, is less restrictive. So their notion would be someone who's lived here their whole lives, whether they are American citizen or not, is an American. And by the way, our research has shown that very clearly. And so my point is that like there isn't consensus on that one, because even the individuals in the middle, they tend to be commonsensical, but there's a lot of conditionality to their support. And I think the more the more images that come out that are negative, the less your support you're going to have from this middling group. So, long answer to your short question, very important question. I don't think there's going to be consensus on this. I think the Trump administration will be able only to do as much as it can do before things the friction gets so high and so noisy that there'll be some sort of step back.
And is there any way that this issue sort of resolves and we move on to other issues, maybe before 2026, maybe before 2028? It's hard for me to see, but is there any way that the tension comes out of this and we move to maybe a belief that the system isn't as broken and that nativism, that some of these differences, we find a way to overcome some of our differences, which are rooted in party?
No, I don't think so.
Yeah.
I think that these structural aspects of our society, the rift on who counts and who doesn't, or the belief that the system is broken, which, by the way, is high across parties.
Yeah.
But the Republican Party has especially become the anti-establishment party. When you look at the data, it's very clear. But these things aren't going anywhere in the short term. And so we're going to be grappling with these looking forward. Now, we might not have the same sort of figure as Trump in the future, which definitely amplifies everything. But the underlying structural reasons for what we're seeing, the forces, as we said before, the forces that have shaped our world, will be here in the medium and even longer term.
Yeah. So let me change it up just a little, thinking about the future. If the Republican Party has sort of captured the anti-establishment vote, and they are also more of the nativist political party at the moment, what do the Democrats do? There's this conversation: should the Democratic Party go all in on sort of a left-wing populism? Is that the answer, the best answer that they have right now, or are they better off saying, well, those guys, the system is broken, they can't fix it, and we're just going to wait until you need someone who understands the establishment again?
Yeah, that's a great question. I would argue that they have to stay away from this whole democracy authoritarianism mantra. I don't think it's effective. It might do a good job in ginning up the base and mobilizing the base, but doesn't have broad-based appeal. I think they have to go old school and start defending the working class and showing the inequities in the system and questioning why billionaires are cutting your programs. I think that's the most effective way, or most effective tack for the Democrats. They need to stay away from the culture war arguments, which Republicans were very effective at reframing as issues of fundamental fairness, which, by the way, is extremely sticky in America. And tracked these individuals in the middle. Like, they brought Trump's victory was more muscular, and part of that was obviously cost of living. That's what won it for him. But they were able to bring over, more people into the coalition because of this notion that the culture wars, culture issues had gone too far. And so my point is, Democrats need to go back to the basics. It's about economics. It's about economic inequality. Why are billionaires ultimately making the decisions for you? We have a debt, but the debt isn't a function of discretionary spending. It's a function of elites making decisions that cost a lot of money. So shouldn't everyone in society pay their fair share? My point is, that's probably where the Democrats need to be. Now, whether they can get there, that's another issue. And obviously, elections are sort of like test cases or laboratories for that. My suspicion is that those candidates that are more effective will have more traditional economic arguments than those that don't.
Yeah, and I would generally agree. I mean, embedded in the system is broken questionnaire is this question about the economy is rigged, and I think that in theory that should play well to the Democratic base, and these questions of fairness that Republicans have done, I think, better on over the last several election cycles is something that it seems like Democrats should understand and be able to position themselves well on if they can play those themes.
Yeah, I just add to that. So our research shows that, stepping back a bit. So since 2016, we've had this program called the Cues and Clues program, where we've collected people, places, and things, favorability towards people, places, and things, towards words, right? And what we found is, like, a lot of words are very divisive, but there are a subset of words, really a subset of values, we call them foundational values, like freedom, fairness, civility, responsibility, as examples, that 90% plus of Americans adhere to or agree with, right? And what we find is that these values actually play themselves out in the political, Game of Thrones going on, right? And it's really about, each side trying to frame these values to their advantage and showing how the other side violates them. Mm-hmm. And so the point is that the Republicans were much more effective this electoral cycle at showing how the culture war issues were fundamentally unfair.
Right.
And so they framed it to their advantage, and they showed how the other side was violating a very sort of foundational value for humans, which is fairness. So to your point, making the economic argument, like why the heck are billionaires taking away your stuff? I mean, a very easy fairness argument to make, right? It's a much sort of more hallowed ground, let's say, solid ground for Democrats than, let's say, some of the culture war issues, which are, when you look at public opinion, even are more fringe relative to the center.
Mm-hmm. Now, we're beginning to run out of time. I did want to get your thoughts on sort of the potential. Looking at the future, are there any things that you're especially paying attention to? We've had a lot of coverage of sort of the Elon Musk Trump feud. I'm not sure that that's not mostly noise. I don't know what the one thing that I think is maybe potentially interesting about it is Musk, like Trump, doesn't seem to mind to burn the village to the ground in order to win. So that makes it a little different than his normal interactions, maybe with some other Republican politicians, where he's been very good at isolating critics and pushing them out. But do you see any? Is there anything you see that is going to reset where we are right now in sort of the fundamentals of what's going on in politics, or where Trump is and where he's going, or where the Democratic Party is and where the Democratic Party is going?
No, I think it'll be noise. I think you're right. I think the big issue is what will be the impact of tariffs ultimately? What will be the feedback loop? Mm-hmm. How negative will it be? It doesn't look like it will be that negative, to be quite frank. And so if you look at the projections by most, base case being 10% tariffs across the board, it doesn't get it to the levels in terms of inflation or unemployment that would significantly impact approval ratings. I mean, maybe we're wrong, and maybe in this case it'll be slightly different, but probably not. But that said, I think that's the next big thing to look out for. Like, let's say summer-ish, right? Or when we maybe start feeling some of that pinch. On the Democratic side, I don't think we can see really anything until the elections happen, because there'll be elections that will define the new crop of leaders and the relative positioning of the party. Indeed, every party that loses the presidential election comes out kind of discombobulated, and we should understand the Democrats as such. Like, they don't have a leader, and they have even a more complicated situation where they had their leader who stepped out and another one stepped in, but wasn't voted on in a popular way. Didn't have popular sort of mandate. And so, they're a little bit discombobulated, but that will all change once the elections happen. So I think it's those two things, really. I mean, there'll be a lot of other stuff here and there, but it's going to be the impact of the economy, and then it will be the elections.
Well, and returning to a big theme before we close out is public opinion really does matter on these tariffs, but also elite opinion, because Trump came in sort of with a hammer. He got pushback. He refined his approach to where now it looks like it's going to be a more refined approach and maybe not as big of an impact, so that, if he had just kept with what he came in with, you're probably seeing the constraint of public opinion. It's going to be felt in terms of negative approval, but he responded and reacted in real time. And even though that seems sometimes like he doesn't have a political philosophy that he's really playing with, he does. He's just trying to gauge the right amount, right?
Yeah, I think so. I think that's the right interpretation. I think that, like, he uses trial balloons like all politicians, though his trial balloons are public. So that's what he did. And I think that's why his approval ratings dropped like they dropped, and then that's why they've gone back up since then, because he stepped off the gas, and we talked about that. So we'll see what happens with immigration. I think the immigration issue, there's more staying power there.
Yeah.
Because his base is especially in favor of what he's doing. And the business community is not going to push back like it pushed back on tariffs.
Well, I wish we had more time, but that's all the time we have for today. Looking forward to you joining us in the fall, and looking forward to talking more.
Awesome.
Thank you,
Kirby.
Cliff. That's this episode of Inside Political Science. If this is your first time listening, click the subscribe button so you never miss an episode. Thanks for joining us.
Inside Political Science is a production from KAMU, Aggieland's Public Television and Radio. For more information, visit tx.ag/insidepoliticalscience. Have a question for our experts? Email them at insidepolicy@tamu.edu. Also, subscribe to the show on your favorite podcast platform so you never miss a new episode.